Thank you once again for joining us at this forum as we continue or we come to an end of our 8-country election series in partnership with the Henrik Ball Foundation and the Elephant. In the run-up to the elections in 2021, this series intended to provide a longer-term view on the democratic development of the region by providing critical analysis and space for debate on the pertinent election processes and governance issues during this season. Over the past year, countries across the East African region have held elections to elect leaders at various levels. These polls have been accompanied by complaints over irregularities, violence, and the general lack of credibility. In Uganda and Tanzania, disputed polls and allegations of rigging by incumbents were followed by brutal crackdowns on democratic freedoms. In Ethiopia, despite the AU's election observers mission declaring the twice postponed election orderly, peaceful, and credible, a fifth of the country failed to take part in voting, owing to an opposition boycott, war, insecurity, and logistical problems. Somalia's failure to hold long-delayed indirect elections has endangered its fragile peace. While in Somaliland, despite urban low voter turnout and ballot tampering in the rural areas, the long-delayed parliamentary and local council elections were smoothly run, leading to a surprising loss to the ruling party and a peaceful transfer of power. Still, harassment of opposition candidates during campaigns and women exclusion remains a feature of the electoral process. Discussants today will reflect on the progress made in democratizing the region and how much remains to be done to ensure that elections are not flashpoints for violence and state crackdowns, while allowing effective participation by all sectors of society. As I said, today's forum is the last in the series, and we do hope that it will be a lively one with a lively debate, and that it will be relevant to those in the room who are covering elections. Our moderator today is Patrick Gathara. Patrick is a writer, columnist, a political commentator on Kenyan and international affairs. He's also the curator-in-chief at the Elephant. My name is Pauline Otieno-Skepa, and I'm the Forum and Education Manager here at the Institute. The Forum is a program of the Institute, and it's a neutral platform that is dedicated to critical exploration, discussion, and debate on important political, economic, and social issues within the Horn and Eastern Africa. This session is being recorded for a podcast, and we will be live tweeting. Please, can you post your questions on the Q&A section that the tab appears at the bottom of your screen. And as I said before, kindly introduce yourself in the chat, name and affiliation, so we know who's in the space with us. So without further ado, asanteni sana for joining us. And Patrick, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for joining in. As was said before, my name is Patrick Gathara, and I'm the curator-in-chief at the Elephant, and we're doing this alongside the Rift Valley Institute and the Henrik Ball Foundation. So joining me now to discuss this question about democratization in the region and what we can learn from the elections that have happened since the beginning of the year. Are three, I think, very well qualified about this. We've got Justin Willis, who is a professor at the University of Durham in the UK. He has extensive research experience in Eastern Africa. Justin was one of the editors of the Sudan Handbook, and his most recent book, which I would really recommend that you guys have a look at, is The Moral Economy of Elections in Africa, Democracy, Voting, and Virtue, which really looks at why we've got sort of the dichotomy between people voting for tribal kingpins, if you will, in the region, are still insisting on having free, fair elections. So I think that it's a really important book, and you guys should have a look at it. We also have Rashid Abdi, who is a Horn of Africa researcher and analyst, currently working for Sahand Research Africa as a key expert on Somalia. He previously served as the Horn Project Director for the International Crisis Group, and started his career with the BBC monitoring, and also worked with the Nation Media Group, East Africa's biggest media conglomerate, at senior editorial levels. He holds advanced degrees in communication and philosophy and has written extensively on the Horn. And finally, last but not least, we've got Samira Gaid, who is a regional and security analyst with extensive experience in Somalia and the Horn. She served as the former special advisor to the Prime Minister of the Federal Republic of Somalia from May 2017 to July 2020, during which she led efforts to reform the Somali security sector. Prior to that, Samira worked with the AU mission in Somalia as a special advisor to the special representative of the chairperson of the commission. She is recently graduated from the National Defense University at the United States with an MA in Strategic Security Studies with an irregular warfare concentration. So thanks a lot, guys, for joining us. Thanks a lot, Willis, Rashid, and Samira. And I think we can get this show on the road. So Samira, let me start with you. What do you make of the recent elections that we've had across the region? And do you think as a region we are moving forward or backwards when it comes to democratization?
Thank you, Patrick. I just wanted to also add that I'm now the executive director of Peril Institute, which is a security think tank based in Mogadishu. But to answer your question, I really think from the recent elections, when you look at what happened in Uganda, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Somaliland, being the positive story out of all the elections in the region recently, you really don't have much to be proud of or much hope in the processes that have been ongoing. One positive thing is that it's now become a regular thing that we do expect elections, we do expect democratization to be the way that we move forward. But aside from that, it has now become like a checkbox exercise where we know what is expected. It's a mantra. You have to have one person, one vote, and everybody works towards that. Nobody really cares to see if that's really devolved or if it's working under the surface, or if it's being manipulated by the powers that be at the time to install their governments, to reinstall their governments. So I really don't think there's much positive developments when you look at it that way.
Rashid, do you agree?
Hello, Patrick, and I'm sorry I can't switch the video on because of poor Wi-Fi, but I want to commend the RVI and the Elephant for actually putting together this fantastic webinar. I think it is very timely. We have had a number of elections across the region. Kenya is going to an election next year. Ethiopia has just had its election. Somalia is going to have its election soon. Somaliland has just had its election. So this is an election year, and it is actually good that we are raising these discussions. But I think it is also, I think, important to ask the fundamental questions. All these elections, are they actually advancing good governance? Are they leading to peace? Are they leading to stability? Or are they fomenting conflict? And I think that clearly in some countries we have seen actually a trend towards electoral dictatorship. And this is a trend which has been going on, I think, for a number of years. But we are also seeing, I think, very optimistic and very encouraging signals, especially in northern Somalia, in Puntland, but also we are seeing the same in Somaliland. So historic, we are beginning to see a historic shift in all Somalia, where the south is still, in a messy kind of a political electoral scenario, but in the north we are beginning to see a lot of progress. And Somaliland's election in particular was, I think, quite significant despite the setbacks. So generally, I think the picture is mixed, Patrick. I think there is room for definitely an improvement, and I do share some of the sentiments Samira made, that we can build on some of the successes that have been made.
Yeah, before I come to you, Justin, Rashid, what do you mean by electoral dictatorships? What maybe you might try and unpack that for our audience.
I think this is a term which denotes a number of things, but I think from where I sit, it essentially means elections as rituals, as basically 5-year rituals, and in most cases, elections that have been pre-rigged, in which you have very shambolic processes, where you have an electoral commission that basically is not neutral, is very partisan. And this we see, there are actually a number of states which are very competent and efficient electoral dictatorships. And I would count probably Uganda as among one of those states, where the state has basically become adept at rigging and stealing elections in every electoral cycle. So I think that term is not controversial at all. And Professor Willis may be able to help us on the academic side. Back to you.
All right, Justin, what do you think? Do you think the region is moving forward or backwards? And feel free to jump in on the electoral dictatorship question.
Well, I'll come to that at the end. Thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me today. So, I mean, it seems to me it would be easy to tell a story at the moment about elections that is, depending on your viewpoint, either very gloomy or very radical. The gloomy version runs like this. The electoral principle around the world is increasingly under threat as the outcome and fairness of elections is challenged by very vocal actors in the US and elsewhere. The wave of democratization through elections in Africa has broken. An era which began in Benin more than 30 years ago is drawing to a close, and in its wake, governments will be free to become less accountable, more authoritarian, and elections will become empty shams or simply cease to happen. In that view, democracy is in peril. But the radical version of the same narrative would see the whole thing in more positive terms. It would say that an external attempt to impose a particular vision of democracy on Africa has run out of steam. That attempt was tied to a particular vision of political and economic order, to what some would call a liberal governmentality that focused on individuals and their responsibility and helped to atomize society. And it was linked to an international financial order dominated by the World Bank. For people who take that viewpoint, what is happening at the present, the retreat of the electoral wave, is probably a good thing because it opens space for more radical change. Democracy, in that view, far from being in peril, may be at last getting a chance to emerge from the shadow of the ballot box. Now, I don't actually subscribe to either of those points of view, I should say, but I think that both of them kind of point us to the idea that this is a moment of profound change. And they both deal with very real international phenomena. The democracy in peril view, I think, risks overstating the role and efficacy of international pressure around elections since the 1990s. The interventions and pressures that have been exerted by what we like to call the international community have not routinely produced accountable governments or transfers of power. Elections since 1990 have often been tools for the assertion of authoritarian power, or have provided mechanism for the negotiation of local and national relationships of patronage, among other things. So the third wave, as some people like to call it in Africa, was a thing, but it was a bit less of an innovative and transformative thing anyway than people like to suggest. By the same token, though, I think electoral politics haven't simply been a device for neoliberal dominance, as some would like to argue. Electoral politics have actually provided space for contestation and popular mobilization. They haven't just narrowed politics down to the casting of the ballot, at least in some circumstances. They've created space for the flourishing of forms of organization which do not reduce voters simply to subjects, but draw their strength from shared ideas of moral belonging, whether those be ethnic or regional or other. And at the same time, the idea of citizenship, which is inherent in universal suffrage, that every adult has a voice of equal value and has the same right to be represented, is a powerful idea, and it has and it continues to inspire action and claims making by ordinary people across Africa. So elections have been tools of authoritarians, and they have been theatres of patronage, but they've also provided ways for people to question authoritarianism and to articulate ideas about moral community and belonging. And the different possibilities of that moral citizenship are open to question. But elections have provided space for this contest, and I think they'll continue to do so. And that's partly what the book that Patrick said such kind things about says. Now, all that leads me to think that, yes, we are in a moment of change. The world has changed significantly. And there are both perils and opportunities to that. I think it is likely that there will be less diplomatic finger wagging and less international pressure around elections in the future than there has been in the last 2 or 3 decades. There'll probably be a smaller presence of international experts and observers. And perhaps there will be less of an attempt to achieve political goals simply through perfecting electoral process. But elections across the region, across Africa, are going to continue to be prominent features of African politics, and they'll continue to be focuses for contest over different possibilities of moral belonging and for arguments over how leaders should lead and what their responsibilities are. Democracy is a pretty hard thing to measure, and I think it would be unrealistic anyway to suggest that elections alone could ever produce democracy. But whatever democracy is, the ability to argue over the relationship between rulers and ruled, and to make claims about the nature of that relationship is surely crucial to democracy. And elections are going to continue to provide a problematic and flawed, but very real way to do that into the future, as they have in recent decades. So I'm neither super gloomy nor super optimistic. I think this is a continuing struggle, as they say.
I don't know, maybe we should actually start it with Justin on this. But if I may come to you, Samira, there is a push, and I think Justin has hinted towards, especially in the context of Somalia, to have one man, one vote elections as a goal. Now, my question following up with what Justin has just said, are elections actually a good thing? Is that something that you think we should be aiming towards?
Thank you, Patrick. I think, you would find little opposition to, democratization and having accountable leaders. I think we all want that, and most Somalis would tell you that's exactly where we should go. We should go to one person, one vote. But in places like Somalia, where elections now become the make or break, the reason why the fragile systems fall apart, then you have to question as to whether we should continue to push the same envelope, or political settlements should come first before an electoral process. And I think there's been that ideal and a mantra by the international community to each political administration, and each political administration agrees to this because there is the rules and the economic support that comes with committing to this path. But is it workable in the context of Somalia? I don't believe so.
Yeah, but just to follow up on that, I mean, the idea that elections bring accountability. Kenya has had elections fairly regularly since the 1960s, actually even before, since 1957, I would say. It doesn't seem to have delivered much accountability. So is it something that Somalia is pretty much going to be going down the same route?
I think that there's that fundamental question on whether elections deliver democratization, or is there other systems that could deliver this. So in terms of Somalia, we have the clan system and systems that existed way before democratization or the colonialists came into play. And did those systems deliver justice? Did they deliver participation, inclusivity? Does this replace a good system? Those are questions that still need to be debated in places like Somalia. In Kenya and in many places in Africa, I do sense that we have learned what we need to deliver to outwardly appear as if we're playing by the rules. And this is a rule-based system, and so you can check the boxes and say we have done that. And the IC is a very big part of that game.
Rashid, I know you spoke of Ethiopia as an example of an electoral autocracy or dictatorship. But my question is there an alternative to elections? Rashid, can you hear me? You are muted if you're speaking. Okay, I guess we'll get Rashid a bit later. I'm not sure whether he's still, he can hear us. Justin, what do you think? Is there an alternative to elections? Is it something that we should persevere with till we get them right?
It's not so much the kind of an alternative. I think the mistake is in thinking that elections by themselves will transform things. And if you can have a kind of an election with a particular specified kind of process that you do absolutely perfectly, then somehow your politics will just become cool. I mean, actually, there is no society in the world in which elections alone can deliver democracy. Right? They have to be kind of rooted in other forms of popular association and popular mobilization within particular legal systems. There's a lot of other stuff that goes on. Now, personally, I'm actually quite a fan of elections by adult suffrage. I think they do kind of have certain political roles as symbolic statements, and I think they do. Even in Kenya, there is a kind of accountability that comes out, although I agree it's a distinctly imperfect one. So, but I think the mistake is to think that that alone will do anything. And it's also a mistake to think that that is a model that's going to fit easily and straightforwardly onto any society in the world. It may well be that other things are actually more important alongside it in some contexts. Mm-hmm. But I would kind of sort of wave a bit of a flag for elections by universal suffrage, because I do think they do make that statement about equality, about the ability of people to express a voice. It's just that by themselves, they're not enough. They can't deliver democratization alone. And it's a mistake to kind of get sort of too hung up on the idea that if we just get the election right, this society will transform, because of course, that isn't how people live their lives. Elections can be super useful, but they won't in themselves change everything. That's not a reason not to have them. It's just a reason not to overestimate what they can do. And also, sorry to go on, but to be aware that they can potentially have pernicious consequences. I mean, it's quite easy, as Rashid has already kind of averred to this. It's quite easy for authoritarians to build elections by universal suffrage into patterns of authoritarian rule and patterns of authoritarian mobilization. This is a form which lends itself to more than one kind of politics, and we'll kind of have to bear that in mind as well.
Right. Rashid, are you there now? Do you think there are alternatives to elections, or what's your view on that?
Yes, the alternative will be the Greek ideal and a philosopher king. But I don't think that is quite possible. I think we somehow have to make do with a 4-year, 5-year electoral cycle, in which probably we recycle the same kind of leadership, in which we entrench the same kind of leadership. We don't modify or change policies. And I think elections have in some ways also become great drivers of conflict and division. And I think of course, we have no alternative but to, support elections which are clean and credible. At the same time, I think we must recognize the dysfunctional nature of electoral politics in Africa, and especially in the Horn. You have, I think, authoritarian leaders who have become quite adept at giving a veneer of democratization and also electoral credibility. But along the line, we realize that these elections are actually rigged. Just take the example of a country like Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a vast country, has had a very difficult history, has had coups, revolutions, and has had a long protracted history of instability. And elections have never been credible throughout history, even when the EPRDF ruled. I think the closest Ethiopia came to a credible election was in 2005. And immediately that election was cancelled. And then there was a crackdown on the opposition. And from then onwards, it was a downward spiral. Now, Abiy, who came into power, on the back of a massive wave of popular revolution in Ethiopia, And in the first few months, he embarked on very progressive reforms in Ethiopia. And everybody was encouraged and said that this is a Democrat and, he's going to really change the situation. Unfortunately, he's made the situation in Ethiopia even worse than what it was before. And we see him not embarking on actually electoral credibility, but actually consolidating elections as a form of consolidating authority and power by locking up the opposition, by basically having a token opposition and not a real opposition. But that having said, I think also in Ethiopia, we saw also very interesting dynamics in which in regional politics, there was actually competition. So this is the paradox in the Horn. I think ordinary people at the grassroots are yearning for change and are yearning for, reforms. Unfortunately, we have a political elite that basically is so wedded to electoral dictatorship. And I think time has come for people like you, Patrick, and your publication to really demand, I think, greater changes. Back to you.
Rashid, just a quick follow-up. When we have situations such as Ethiopia, which was, clearly you had a civil conflict happening. You had a boycott by the opposition, and as you said, people being jailed and stuff. Is it that they shouldn't have had their elections? What would your view be on that? I mean, did they help in any small way, or should they simply not have had them because they seem to legitimize a system that you have problems with?
Actually, the paradox in Ethiopia is that it actually has a very efficient and competent electoral commission, which is actually very good at conducting, voter registration. Of course, there were pockets of Ethiopia where, because of conflict and instability, they were unable to register, and these were about, in the Somali state, in Afar, in Harar. These were places where the Electoral Commission had difficulties in registration, but the registration process went smoothly. But I think the dilemma for Ethiopia and I think the biggest problem is that, can you really conduct a credible election in the midst of a conflict and war? And that, I think, is the big philosophical question, which I think one has to ask about Ethiopia. Clearly, if you look at just the technical point of view, the elections were actually smoothly well run. The problem is that there wasn't any opposition. The only opposition that mattered was in the rural areas, And so, what is the use of having a competent, excellent, well-oiled electoral machinery when it's a one-horse race? And I think,
but I think Justin might ask whether even having a credible election by itself would actually move things forward. Because I think if you look, for example, in how Kenya approaches it, we bring all these technological fixes to ensure that our elections are not stolen, but they never seem to really deliver elections that people actually believe in. So I'm wondering whether the focus on simply let's have the election, let it be a credible reflection of what people think, whether that by itself would actually fix too much in societies that are clearly quite fractured.
I don't know whether that's to me or to Justin. Yeah, okay.
Over
to you, Prof.
Justin, take it on.
I mean, remember, I know nothing about Ethiopia, right? But there is an argument that says, right, that just the holding of elections in itself does potentially change people's relationship to the state and does change people's sense of what academics like to call their subjectivity. It makes people think, okay, I'm a citizen of the state, I have this relationship, I have a voice, and that might, in a way, that might have empowering effects on them. It might also, of course, have disciplining and constraining effects. But I think we shouldn't assume it doesn't do anything. I think it almost certainly does something. the fact that it doesn't kind of do the things that people might want or expect it to do doesn't mean it doesn't do anything. Right? So first off, I think that actually...
I think it's whether that thing that it does, whether we want it to be done.
Yes, that's really what I was going to come on to. So then the question is, okay, well, so what if that thing that it does is just make people think, okay, well, I'm a citizen, and what a good citizen does is obediently line up and put a piece of paper in a ballot and go home again. That's probably not necessarily so great. I mean, that doesn't really increase sort of genuine, but if an election provides a space for local community mobilization, for argument about the nature of right and wrong, for what's good and what's, that actually then it begins perhaps to give people both the sense that they're citizens with a voice and the sense that democracy might mean something more than just putting your piece of paper in the ballot box, right? So I think that possibility exists. In the Ethiopian case, the little I read about this kind of does indeed suggest that this has tended to have a closing down effect in some ways, but it has also, of course, tended to make governing parties think harder about how they respond and what they do. I mean, it is undoubtedly the case that the previous regime in Ethiopia had to rethink how it did politics at a local level as a result of 2005, and it did do things differently as a result. Now, that didn't turn Ethiopia into a democracy, but it did change the way that some people at least got to relate to the state and the possibilities of relationship with the state. So again, elections, the fact that they don't deliver the abstract thing called democratization, doesn't mean that they don't do something, and doesn't mean they don't actually sometimes bring what we might consider benefits in a political sense in terms of opening up certain kinds of space. It's just that they don't do magic.
Right. Samira, in terms of Somalia, and actually Somaliland, if you might think about the election that they just had, people were quite happy, or it was hailed around the world. There was a transfer of power, but there wasn't a single woman who was elected in there. So again, should we take the idea of elections with a pinch of salt? Do they just further some of the divisions and the problematics that might be present in society? And would it be perhaps time for us to say there are times to have elections and there are times not to have them?
In my view, I think elections do provide, at least some hope that things will get better, and you see some incremental change with each cycle, especially in Somalia. I mean, you had the 2000 transitional national government replaced in 2004 by a process that was, overseen in Kenya, and then you had, the elections in 2012 that brought Hassan Sheikh. Again, the elections that brought President Farmajo, of course, not universal suffrage per se, but at least there was incremental change. And I think in the context of southern Somalia, at least that's positive. And without that, it will be the jungle law. I don't think the actors in Somalia would sit passively without a process that, at least look like it would change something every 4 years. So I think it's in that sense, elections are good. The other thing that I just wanted to mention is that the Somaliland election, where you do not have a single woman, is sometimes a reflection of society, and so does the society know 100% what's best for them? Should there be checks and balances when it comes to those basics, women representation, people with disabilities, minorities, the marginalized? Should there be accommodation for them in processes like the ones in Somalia? I think definitely there's an argument for that. But then also on the Somaliland elections, there's a romanticization that there's been several peaceful elections, but political disputes in Somaliland are usually settled through local means, not through this electoral process. It's important that you should know that both the presidential and parliamentary elections have been delayed several times. The upper house has been sitting since the 1990s. The Somaliland parliament was last elected in 2005 until this year. So they overstayed more than 10 years. So it is true that in the north, the traditional resolution performs better than in the south, but it's more institutionalized and cultured as compared to what you see in the south.
Rashid, is there scope for institutionalizing indigenous forms of governance, what we might call it indigenous democracy, I suppose, But is there scope for doing that in countries such as Ethiopia, where you've got huge, disparities? You've got different ethnic groups, different traditions, different, to a sense, histories. Do you think it? I mean, unlike Somalia, obviously, which for a lot of people is seen as homogeneous. Do you think that their example might be something that Ethiopia might look towards?
I think Ethiopia and Somalia are quite different. Ethiopia has remained throughout, I think, a strong state with strong institutions. And that is why I said, even in the midst of conflict, you had actually the Electoral Commission actually performing very well. And that, I think, is one of the benefits of having a strong state with the fundamental structures still intact. Now, Somalia has been without a government for the last 30 years. And as Samira has said, a lot of the, power has reverted back to the clans. And it is the clans that wield influence. Now, I'm not, I don't want to give this Eurocentric vision and say that democracy, Africans have never had democracy. If you look at literature and history, actually, you'll be surprised to learn that Somalis were actually called a pastoral democracy. They had a very robust systems of very egalitarian and inclusive systems of government before colonialism. So I think it is about an enlightened leadership, marrying what is good in the tradition and modernizing it. And we see similar, we see in the case of Somaliland, that kind of a potential, where you had the Gurti, or the Council of Elders, actually providing a sort of an umbrella or a sort of a safety net for that nascent democracy. And I think the progress Somaliland has made is largely because of that ability of creating a hybrid system with the modernizing liberal style democracy plus indigenous forms of governance. In Somalia, you also had similar structures, but as Samira has said, the North has tended to have that better for a variety of reasons. One of them based on a very hypothetical historical notion that the Brits were better at nurturing indigenous systems, and the Italians were basically going and smashing indigenous systems. I don't want to go that far, but that is one theory which is out there. But all I can say is that Ethiopia actually is an interesting case where you can actually build institutional democracy. In Somalia, the institutional system has been hijacked by elite compacting. Look at the electoral process in Somalia for the last, since 2000 up to today. It is actually not led by institutions. The Electoral Commission is all but in name. It is actually about the regional leaders coming and meeting the president and modifying electoral rules as they go along. The electoral model has been modified close to 6 times now in Somalia, and largely not through institutions, not through the electoral system, electoral agency, but through elite compacts, the regional leaders and the president coming together. So I think between Ethiopia and Somalia, you have 2 radical and very different systems of government. One with the fundamental structures of a strong state still intact. Another one, having that kind of rudimentary structures, but now hijacked by an elite, which I don't think is interested in really democratization. And that, I think, is the dilemma which Somalia faces.
But Rashid, if we had a pastoral democracy that didn't engage in this big event we call an election, doesn't that raise a question whether we still need to have it? I mean, just because the kind of modernistic idea of democracy involves a big event that everybody turns up to vote, doesn't mean that we need to necessarily go and keep replicating it, especially when it clearly for many societies is not working.
I hear you, Patrick, but I tend to share Professor Justin Willis's idea that this ritual of democracy has its own utility and psychological functions. I think even if, it has become hollowed out, people become accustomed to the idea. And as we have seen, even in Ethiopia, you had at the national level a very corrupt, rigged process. But down in the grassroots, you actually had real competition. And that, I think, is some of the functions, the benefits that accrue from having this kind of cyclical elections. Of course, that doesn't mean that we don't need to refine it and improve it. And we are in a sorry state in the Horn. But that said, I think the symbolism itself and this repeated exercise, I think, carries its own weight. So I still think that, we shouldn't abolish elections the way Isaias Afewerki has done for the last 30 years.
I don't think even Isaias would argue that what he has in Eritrea is a democracy. But what I'm wondering, Justin, is whether, given that there seems to be places, or levels at which elections work, deliver some form of accountability, and even in Kenya, you might think of how at the level of MPs, of members of parliament, etc., there is quite a lot of competition, and elections pretty much are accepted at that level. But there are other levels where they're clearly problematic and can lead to violent outcomes. Whether we might need to adopt a more, how to put it, nuanced idea of how elections should work. I'm always afraid of this term of African democracy, that it's somehow we are different from everybody else. We've got to have things differently. But is there scope for that? What do you think?
Yeah, well, like you, I'm a little skeptical about kind of African democracy as an idea, both because it kind of collectivizes a whole continent, but also because it kind of then differentiates everybody on that continent somehow. I mean, it seems to me that kind of people in Africa there's lots of enthusiasm for voting and for the idea of having a voice through voting, just as there is in other parts of the world. This is quite an appealing idea for humans, I think. But that question, and kind of going back to Rashid's point about kind of the pastoral democracy, well, of course, the point about the pastoral democracy was that the stakes and the institutional terrain were a little bit different to those of, say, Somalia or Kenya as governments operating in an international system of states, right? So it's not necessarily straightforward to translate forms of egalitarian or consensual government from one context into another. And I think we have to kind of be a little bit careful about where people say, oh, kind of this society, yeah, it's super consensual historically and culturally, so, we don't need votes. But there's a kind of lot of stuff, human society in the 21st century tends to be extremely complicated in its institutional and economic forms, right?
Right.
And I'm not saying that human society in the past wasn't complicated. It's just become complicated in slightly more different ways. And so just translating kind of real or imagined form or institutions onto the present won't necessarily work. I would say, though, I mean, to go back to kind of my big theme, I suppose, which is I think that elections do something. I think that elections can do powerful political work, and that can be quite good, powerful political work. But by themselves, they're not really going to change anything. They have to be embedded in a set of other institutions and practices. And so we probably do need to think quite carefully about what they're going to do in particular circumstances, and in some cases, where the effort should go in terms of
pretty much
ensuring that people have a voice, ensuring that there is some kind of accountability.
Right. So pretty much the idea that there's this one template of how to run a democratic country, that's kind of imaginary. It doesn't work.
Well, yeah, it's imaginary. Actually, if you look at countries that would style themselves as electoral democracies, actually they're all different. Right? I mean, they mostly have in common that they have universal suffrage, but in terms of their constitutions and the structures and their legal structures, I mean, there are loads of different ways of doing this, right? So we shouldn't imagine that the secret ballot is itself the key to governmentality, right? It's a particular form of political engagement, which can have, I think, in certain contexts in our world, quite a lot of benefits, but it doesn't in itself kind of deliver political change or make everyone's life immediately better. And we have to think about it in kind of context, right? That's important.
Well,
I mean, that's really obvious. And if everyone's listening thinking, oh, it's really obvious, it is really obvious. I'm not sure we've always thought about it quite so clearly. Sorry.
Well, I get what you're saying. I don't know that we still have you, Samira. I'm seeing your thing is, oh, all right. So just a quick reminder to everybody. You can put in your questions under the chat, under the Q&A, and we'll pick them up and pose them to the participants. Thanks. What I can see, there's a long comment here by Francis, who thinks that it's the lack of respect coupled with the lack of a human face, which is an interesting phrase, that is respect for lives, including those of the opposition who are brutalized, makes election outcomes or the legitimacy of electoral outcomes are questionable. And then we also have a question specifically, I think this would go to Samira, on abolishing the 4.5 systems through which clans in Somalia share power. I don't know whether you want to address those, Samira, and then we can go around the
Thanks, Patrick. And just to touch on just what you guys were talking about a few seconds ago, I think replacing elections or this system, it might be too late, especially for the Horn of Africa. The horse is out of the stable, per se. The allure of what modern state system offers to Somali actors and the competition that exists within them, between them, and why they aspire to gain leadership to dominate others, I think it's irreversible, and we just have to make do and find out a way of balancing those competing interests. But on the 4.5 system, I think it is, especially for women and for minorities and for the marginalized, extremely discriminatory. But at the end of the day, it came about because of a challenge that existed. State collapse 10 years after state collapse, there was no other way to agree on coming around the table and reinstituting the state. And so it was a solution to that. And I don't think replacing it in the midst of the current electoral process would be a solution. We do want to go to one person, one vote, and that would change things. But they should be a process by which you can get from point A to B. And everyone agrees it's time to move on from this system, but I don't think it's time yet.
Actually, before I come to Rashid, Justin, and I think this was kind of quite a big point in your book, regarding this sort of ethnic affiliation and how people organize ethnically when it comes to electoral competition, and the tension between that and the civic virtue, which I think would be, in the case of Somalia, well encapsulated in this idea of the 4.5 versus the one man, one vote thing. Do you think, as clearly Francis thinks, that ethnic affiliation is a problem when it comes to democracy in the region and perhaps in Africa more widely?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, ethnicity is one of the ways that people make claims on one another and on those who represent them. Now, if this turns into a kind of, we have to get our person into state house at all costs, that obviously can be very problematic. But at a very local level, I mean, I think you've already said this, Patrick. If you look at Kenya's elections, actually, if you look at elections in a number of places, the vitality and vigor of local discussions about morality and what leaders should do often derives partly from a shared sense of ethnic membership and collective membership. So there is a kind of accountability, and there is a kind of sense of, I have a right to talk about this because I'm part of this group, and these are the moral forms of behavior. And that sits uncomfortably with straightforward ideas of national citizenship, the idea that you should only and always be a national citizen. Of course, immediately, kind of membership of an ethnic group is in tension with that. But that tension doesn't always have to be wholly destructive. And also, to be quite honest, it's not going to go away anyway. So even, we cannot kind of pretend that people's daily lives and the assumptions they make about the behavior of others and what their obligations are to others are just going to vanish from politics, because they won't. And so, I mean, we have to accept that actually politics has to work along with this, maybe to mitigate some of the worst aspects of it, but to think about, okay, these people live real lives, and the politics in which they engage have to be part of those real lives. Otherwise, they won't mean anything to them.
Right. Rashid, what do you think? I think Ethiopia had and put in its constitution sort of this ethnic blocks and built a system, everybody belonging to, I suppose, a particular ethnic group, and this the society becoming a federation of these groups. Do you think that has made elections easier or more contested? Has it had any effect on how elections are done or perceived?
I think it is definitely a very complex country, and also the issue of ethnicity and ethnic politics, ethnic identity politics, and ethno-regionalism, is a problem in Ethiopia. But I think the genius of the EPRDF government was actually not to shy away from the ethnic nature of the state, and to try to actually find ways to harness ethnicity into a sort of a positive force that can transform Ethiopia. And that is why I think Meles and his people conceived of the idea of an ethnic federal model that actually was very radical and allowed ethnic states to actually secede if they want to. Now, the problem was actually the way in which the ethnic federal system was implemented. In many ways, the EPRDF never let go of power. So a lot of the federal states were just states in name. Power was still centralized and controlled from the center, and never resources and power were held at the center and never dispersed. And I think that is what led eventually to the tensions and the crisis we have seen in Ethiopia in recent years. But I think there is a positive aspect in Ethiopia's politics, in the sense that people don't run away about ethnicity. They are not neurotic like Kenyans about ethnicity. Who outside there, they claim they are liberals and they're progressives, and then back home, when they speak in their mother tongue, they end up. And the same thing with my Somali cousins as well. Is the same problem we have everywhere. And so I think once you put ethnicity out there and you have ethnic parties emerge, and then they coalesce around a coalition. Actually, the most interesting thing that has happened in the current elections, in the recent elections, is that people were debating manifestos, party manifestos, at the local level. This was what decided. People were asking, are you going to promise us this? There were town hall meetings in which people actually appeared to explain their manifestos. Now, in a heavily ethnicized, political system, nobody interrogates a politician on their manifesto. In Kenya, we
so could it be, Rashid, could it then be the case that, for example, by accepting that society is organized along ethnic lines and implementing a system that acknowledges that you basically take it off the table and people can actually get to discuss more important things?
Yes, and I'm a realist. I accept what Justin has just said, which is that ethnicity is going to be, the organizing principle of politics for generations to come. This is how we are wired. We are not going to run away from. Now, the thing, but can you plan progressively to build a system of government that is inclusive, that does not, whereby ethnicity does not actually divide, in which you do not create ethnic dictatorships? And I think that is the challenge before the current generations of Africans is how to acknowledge the reality of ethnicity, the potential benefits of actually harnessing ethnic identity into building a much more bigger collective identity. It's all a matter of the way the state is structured and the incentive which the political system gives to ethnic states. Kenya, for example, is now devolved in some senses, but that the devolution is not necessarily ethnic, but you can see the tensions where you have now the competition devolved towards the periphery, where you have very intense competition between the subclans, between the subgroups, ethnic groups, and that I think is the dilemma. Unless there is a system which arbitrates and allocates resources and power much more equitably, I think we are going to have problems. But I'm all for the idea of not throwing away ethnic identity, but only progressively reforming it and harnessing it into molding it into a positive force. Back to you.
Samira, do you think our so-called founding fathers had it wrong when they told us tribalism was a bad thing?
I think they did have it right. There's an aspect of negative tribalism that comes into play, and like Rashid just said, especially with us, the Somalis, there's this elite, the elitism depending on which clan you come from, and othering other clans and other communities. So I think we did have it right, but what's wrong? What I think is wrong is underestimating the dominant thinking when it comes to clan, especially for Somalia. Clan and Islam are central, and trying to create systems that do not involve or include the two aspects of Somali people, I think it's problematic.
All right. Justin, if I may, Ali Hassi asked about the value of political parties. Now, lots of this seem, at least in the Kenyan example, to hew to kind of ethnic lines. So I think it's kind of related to what we've just been discussing. Do you think they are valuable, or they have shown any value when it comes to democracy and elections in the region?
Well, there is a shed load of academic literature which basically will tell you that parties in Africa don't really work, right? I'd like to qualify that though by asking, well, what do people want political parties to do? And I think there's often an unconscious measuring of the political party in Africa against some imagined political party somewhere else in the world that does something different. And it's a bit like what I said earlier about elections. Political parties do different things in different societies, and they take very different forms. A political party in the United States is very different to a political party in Sweden. They're not the same thing, and they don't do the same thing. And I don't think that political parties across Africa all do the same thing either. Now, there's a lot of talk, I think, about people like to say issue-based politics, which is considered to be a good thing. But of course, issue-based politics in itself what exactly does that mean? And people tend to say, if you have parties, you can have issue-based politics. But neither of those things are really transparent to me as ideals, right?
Yeah, and it depends on what you define as an issue.
Exactly. So what is an issue? Is an issue, do we go to war with Ethiopia? Right. Or is an issue, why isn't there a school down the road from my house? I mean, both of those are kind of legitimate issues. Or is an issue, why hasn't my nephew got a job in the ministry? I mean, actually, all of those.
Why do Kikuyus have all the jobs and we don't?
Yeah,
that can be an issue.
Politics are full of issues. That's kind of a bit of a chimera. And what people, I think, mean by that is that they want kind of parties that have manifestos with sort of recognizable political affiliations that they can map on to some other part of the world. Again, well, why do you want that? So honestly, parties do different things in different African countries. In Kenya, parties tend to be fireworks, right? They zoom up with great noise. It's an election moment. They go boom, and then they vanish, and the people make new parties for the next election. That doesn't mean they don't do anything. They form kind of useful tools for aggregating alliances and putting together groups of interest. But that's not the same as a party in Ghana, where parties are basically corporations that exist over an extended period of time and allocate benefits amongst their members. And it's not the same as a party in Tanzania, where the ruling party is this kind of extremely efficient organization for disciplining and controlling the ambitions of its members, and also for keeping control of the state. So I'm sorry, my answer to the constant complaint about there should be parties in Africa is, well, what kind of parties are you looking for, and what would you like them to do?
What do you want them to do? Right. Samira, you don't hear much talk about parties in Somalia, at least in the wider discussion. What role do they play?
I think it's an important piece of legislation that is required if we're to go to one person, one vote. I think it's one of the tasks for a coming government. But again, just listening in, I think there is that misconception of what the party is expected to do. I think in Somalia, it is expected to be not a clan-based party, and to ensure representation, national representation. So for us, it will cover that. That is the purpose of coming up with political parties, I think, for the next elections.
Yeah, I mean, I know Somaliland, they're quite seriously regulated what can be registered as a political party, etc. What I wonder, and Rashid, feel free to jump in here, is whether we're just taking a template of what we have seen elsewhere. They have political parties, so let's have them. It is without really asking the question Samira and Justin are asking, what are they actually for?
I think in Somaliland, it's quite interesting. Sorry, Rashid has been. I'll pick up.
Go ahead, Samira, then we'll hear from Rashid.
Okay, no, in Somaliland, it's quite interesting, but we forget that it's monolithic. They have unifying factors. It's basically more or less one huge community. The diversity that you see in South Central is not the same diversity that you see in Somaliland. So I think it's much easier to come up with issue-based political parties in Somaliland compared
but they regulate them quite seriously. You can't just form a political party. Yes, so yes. Is it the case that it's actually better to go that way, that route, and to be quite clear, this is where you're forming a party and this is what it's got to look like, rather than Kenya's example where you've got whatever dozens of parties that most of
I think
us
it's
have never
it's influenced by their history, but I think Rashid would be the expert on that. I think it's influenced by the history, by being part of the south of Somalia, and so that's really why it's heavily regulated.
Right. Rashid, what do you think? And also you might want to look at the Kenyan example where there was a big push for let's have multi-party elections, as if that would solve too much, and it doesn't seem to have.
Yes, I think the parties and the way parties operate in Africa, of course, is quite interesting. And in the 90s and 80s, we had a big push when the one-party dictatorship system was dismantled. There was a big push for having many parties. And I think the irony, of course, is that President Moi happened to be right about the multi-party system, because as soon as the parties were allowed, they formed on the basis of ethnicity. And of course, Moi had a hegemonic view of unity, in which unity was actually enforced. It wasn't voluntary. Mm-hmm. So when the one-party system ended, all of us dispersed into our ethnic, shells. Right. And I think that was the landscape in which the debate about multipartyism was formed. And there was also, I think,
although, to be honest, Moi did do a lot to fracture the society once he faced a challenge. He didn't want to have everybody coming together against him.
Yes, indeed, you're right. But I think the key point is that at that point, party formation and party affiliation and the whole push was actually a form of mimicry, there wasn't a very strategic thinking about why we need parties and what parties. And this is the point which I think Justin was trying to say. We need to ask the fundamental questions: what are parties going to achieve, and what difference do they make in politics? Now, I think the sad part, especially the sad aspect of this multi-party politics in Kenya, is that it has not only just become ethnicized, but it has become moribund. Kenya, during the KANU years, had a very strong, solid one party, which, despite its hegemony and authoritarian nature, was actually very efficient in delivering at least some services to rural communities, was efficient as a structure. Now that was dismantled, and its place, we don't have a single party that can match that machinery that KANU was able to have. Now look at CCM, for example, in Tanzania. The era of big one party is over, but what have we replaced it with? We have replaced it with briefcase parties, parties that are dysfunctional, don't exist, only make an appearance 6 months before an election with a brilliant, manifesto, and then dismantled immediately after the elections. So in many ways, our so-called political party system is actually moribund. It's not even dysfunctional, it's moribund. And that is why we should I think, Somalia and other countries, would have to look at their neighbors and learn from that experience. Now, as Samira has said, the Somali system is still in infancy. Parties have just been allowed. There, I think, I can't remember the exact figure, but tens of parties have been registered. But it's only going to function when all these parties have regional toeholds and footprint, and able to organize and debate, create, structures of organization. So far, they haven't done that. And I think it will probably take, not less than at least 5 to 10 years for Somalia to have a robustly machinery. But I think we need to be asking the fundamental questions: what are parties to achieve? And this notion of just having parties for the sake of having parties, I think, is quite
same as
problematic.
having elections for the sake of elections, I suppose.
Yes. Yes.
We've got Dale who wants to ask a question. Fatima, able to unmute him, and he could ask his question.
I think he dropped off, or maybe it was Darky, because I can't find him on the participant.
Okay. All right, no problem then. We'll go ahead. We've got another question here from Francis again, and he's asking about the role of international observers and whether they can help change our electoral or democratic things. I mean, we've had, and Justin, perhaps you could jump in on this, we've had election observers ending up with pretty much egg on their face when it came to the Kenyan elections, which they had initially declared to be free and fair, and it turned out that the Supreme Court reversed them. But also, when you look at the countries that they are coming from, so for example, from the US, they don't seem to be paragons of electoral democracy themselves. So, do you think their role right now is much lessened? Do people take their views with a pinch of salt?
Well, there's a few things to say on this. The first is that kind of election observers, in a way, it's an almost impossible job to get right? Because remember, they're observers. So they're just supposed to watch. They're not supposed to do anything. They're supposed to watch and then give a judgment. And once they've watched, they've got sort of two choices, haven't they? One is they can say, oh, that was all right, or they can say, that was terrible. Now, if they say that was terrible, the consequences of doing that might be pretty disastrous. And you might be kind of widespread violence, might be all kinds of things. So there's actually quite a strong sort of, there's almost an inherent pressure on election observers to say, well, that was sort of all right. they're also in a position where they tend to be kind of locked in an incremental mindset where they're thinking, okay, well, maybe that election wasn't great, but if we sort of point out the nice bits, then maybe there'll be another kind of slightly better election further on. And if we if we just say it was rubbish, then there might never be an election again. So there's a sort of built-in problem to being an election observer, which makes it very hard to do the job usefully. In terms of whether anybody kind of trusts or believes them, well, it tends to, the people instrumentalize election observation quite outrageously. Kind of political actors basically will haul in the election observers to be useful when they want them to be, and then denounce them as rubbish when they say something inconvenient. So it's not kind
but
of...
in general, I mean, since across the 90s, I mean, it used to be a marker of sort of you've done well if you got a report from the EU saying, well, yeah, you ran your elections properly.
Yeah,
so has that changed?
It sort of did, but even then, of course, there was quite a lot of skepticism about it. And it kind of in Kenya, even in the 1990s, some people were very sort of cross at observers for things they said or didn't say about the elections of 92 and 97. So there was never really a golden age of election observation. It's very problematic. People will always instrumentalize it. Does it do anything? Well, it probably does some things. I mean, it does kind of, the idea of scrutiny is, well, it's sort of inherent in elections. I mean, elections they are performances, and therefore they're intended for an audience, and so people watch them. But so I don't think it's completely purposeless. But again, I don't think you can expect election observation in itself to produce really good elections, because it actually is systemically unable to do so. And anyway, people will always either denounce it or welcome it, depending on whether or not it serves their interests.
Rashid, if I may ask, on the wider point about the role of the international community, and I would say international legitimation, if you will, of elections. I mean, we see and we expect, I mean, I remember in the Kenyan elections in 2013, there was the idea that the international community might have a problem with Uhuru and Ruto being elected, and that would be a way of almost discouraging them getting into power. Do you think when the international community's view, or the West, actually I should say the West's view of elections, is still considered to be something important, whether these people will be invited to the White House or to Downing Street?
Well, the short answer is that in a post-Donald Trump world, I think, electoral observation and electoral democracy is probably, not going to be anybody's business. I think Africans will now strut with their chest, out and say that we are Democrats, and that is the sad reality. There isn't a single power today that can stand up credibly and say we are an electoral democracy and we have the moral authority to enforce it. I think we are at a historical phase when democracy in many ways is in retreat in many places, but also even liberal democracies like the US are fraying, and the institutions are actually much weaker than they are. And you also have a strong public change and zeitgeist of nationalism and extreme right views, and so we are beginning, I think, to ask the fundamental questions whether democracy isn't in crisis. And so in that kind of a context,
finish up.
Yeah, in that kind of a context, I think electoral observation in Africa has to be taken with a pinch of salt. And I think but there is something which I think I need to point out, and it's crucial. There is technical observation, which I think is quite useful. Remember, some of these experts who are coming as electoral observers, many of them are actually, first of all, people who have studied the subject, who have done electoral observation in many places, know a lot about the logistics and the competent and the technical details of actual election monitoring. So that bit of the report, usually dealing on the technical aspect and of the elections and the organization and the logistics, is actually quite important for Africans, I think, to take into to basically take positively. Where I think I have a problem with is when electoral observation becomes like that of the African Union. African Union has no competence whatsoever in electoral monitoring. What it does is actually go and endorse big men politics, endorse stolen elections. Just before, during the elections, one of the electoral observers was actually the man who is now the envoy trying to stabilize Ethiopia, and that is Olusegun Obasanjo, a thoroughly discredited figure who can't be expected really to deliver anything to advance peace in Ethiopia. But I think I'm digressing. Back to you.
Samira, if I may ask you about the effect of kind of this retreat that from democracy that Rashid is talking about. Lots of, if you look at, for example, Kenya's a history with quote unquote democratization, lots of it was underwritten by support from the West, from the US. The embassies are where people would run to when government tried to clobber you up and stuff. They provided resources for activists, NGOs organizing to confront it. What happens when they are no longer, or they have more pressing problems at home? Does that mean that we would then either have more space to do our own thing, or would we see a more effective clampdown by governments?
I think Somalia is a very good example. And the last 4 years of the Trump administration and exactly the effect it had on Somali leadership. I think the most leverage the international community had on Somalia was based on the US and the UK to a large extent, mostly the US. And to see them go through the process that they went through and the lack of interest in really democratization, a singular focus on just security matters, I think affected Somalia and is really part of the reason we are where we are today, that you have an electoral process that should have ended in February that's still ongoing. So I really think it's going to be positive for countries like ourselves who the intentions might not initially have been good, have been genuine with the leadership. If the intentions are good, I think a hands-off approach might work, where the local actors are forced to come around the table and come up with systems that are not externally imposed. So in Somalia, for instance, it's either have elections or we cut off support, and the international community did cut off, financial support, the money that we were getting directly to the central bank. The IMF just bailed out the current government, but that's the kind of thing that happens. I don't know if that helps have a better electoral process or makes it worse. So I think it's indicative of the future that we will be left to our own devices. Lack of interest in the Horn, in especially Somalia, and the counterterrorism effort. And so I think it's up to Somalis to really chart out, the democracy that it wants, the form of government that it really needs.
Right. But if you look at what Biden has been saying about sort of revamping the US role in elections, and I know many people will push back and say perhaps it should start by fixing the US system, but still, there are resources that can come for efforts of whether it's civil society actors, etc., to push this. You don't see that as something that we would lose if they don't engage?
In the context of Somalia, in the context of of places like Kenya, that might help. But in the context of Somalia, you really have a very short period to influence Somali leadership, and you have little leverage. And so I don't think we are priority number 1, 2, 10 for the Biden administration right now. So, and that's a paradise. I think that's paradise for the Somali politicians, so they can do what they need to do while the attention is not on them. And so, no,
Right.
I don't think whatever the international community has to offer will work. And that ended in Somalia when the SRSG was removed. So ever since then, we have weaned off that dependency, and there's really not much change to the impact. There's not much change to the lives of Somali people when you look at it that way.
Justin, do you think more people in the region are looking towards places like China and saying, well, that's a system that delivers progress, doesn't have too many issues with elections, they don't have to do it. Look at Rwanda, you can have people who win with 99% of the vote, but they have clean streets, they seem to be doing well. So do you think many guys are looking at that and saying, well, let's go slowly on this democracy thing?
Yeah, well, it would be surprising if people weren't looking at those things, particularly since both the Chinese government and the Rwandan government are quite pleased with their achievements in this area and quite like people to look at them. So yeah, of course, people are looking at that. As always, you have to remember those are very specific societies, the product of very specific historical trajectories. So
Right.
it's just things that work in one place.
Yeah, I mean,
work in other places.
assuming that there is some sort of ideological competition, if you will, sort of harkening back to the days of the Cold War and stuff, that we have a renewed one where there's a model that China presents, there's a model that the US presents. Do you think the region is leaning towards one or the other?
I would hesitate to say that at the moment, but yeah, there is clearly a sense, and I think it's a sense on both sides of that there are different models on offer here. And I think people in each of those countries would like to think that they're offering different models. How people in the region will react to that, I don't know. It'll be interesting to see over the coming months and years. But yeah, that is how it's very easy to present this in those terms.
Right.
If I can also add,
okay.
if I can also add on.
Yeah, go ahead, Rashid.
If I can, yes, before the thought disappears from my head, actually, Isaias Afewerki is the guru of authoritarian learning, and in the last 4 years, I think he has been extremely busy inducting Farmajo as well as Abiy in the dark art of actually centralizing power, dismantling the federal state, and locking up opposition, and this growing climate of claustrophobia in the Horn actually stems from the triumph and the fact that the authoritarian school feels emboldened, not just by Afewerki, but also by China, a resurgent, powerful, assertive state, an America that is on the retreat, a West generally that is on the retreat. So, we are beginning to see, I think, the contours of this debate about whether Africa will take an authoritarian path to development or a democratic path to development. I think, sadly, the liberal democratic project is now tarnished, and old style Democrats like me and liberals are on the retreat. Back to you.
Right. There's a thing that I've been wondering about. There's a time, especially in the 90s, when Africa's problems were framed around leadership. And I think Francis speaks to this when he asks whether the problem or future of democracy is about transformative politics and leadership. And he cites Uganda. So it used to be, Rwanda rather, not Uganda. It used to be said that if only Africans had better leaders, that we would, get to nirvana or be this nice Singaporean sort of place. And I think democracy presupposes the existence of better institutions as opposed to better, rulers. I don't know, Samira, what do you think? Do you think that the discussion is now changing? Are we harkening back to saying, well, let's get just nice people who won't kill us and they will deliver economic progress?
It's hung, so I'm just going to switch off my my video.
Okay.
I think it would be wrong to say that, you know, it's just you cannot just paint it with one brush. I think there's different views across the region, but there is that mentality, there is that sense that, you know, we have to get over and done with this process. But in places like Somalia, it's really, we are really at the beginning of this you know, this entire game. So we are hopeful that it will bring change, it will be positive, we can fashion it to a way that works for Somalis. So we are at the beginning. Places like Kenya, you could say, I think they've learned that this is a system that can be, you know, manipulated in whatever way, and are willing to, you know, just go with the process. The public, you can tell, are quite, you know, fed up of the entire process, and sometimes there is a fear that the public could come in and change how things are done, in you know, to put it honestly. So I think you have to look at it from the different points of view. Places like Uganda, this should be the way to go for a long time. Places like Kenya, where I think at the edge where you might see, you know, a radical change from the public side. But for Somalia, I think we're good to go.
Justin, what do you think? You need to unmute.
I'm sorry, I'm temporarily lost for words, Patrick. So I think we go on to the next question.
All righty. Rashid, you want to jump in on that? Or I can just move on?
Yes, I think there is one country that hasn't come up in our discussion. And I think for me, it is a very fascinating country. First of all, it has a very strong, I think, will to a democratic path. And this is Sudan. Has a very strong, a long history of actually struggle for democratic freedoms, for liberty, has a very well organized civil society, have a strong labor union. And I think if there's one country, you know, in the Horn, which has the structures of actually a very strong liberal democracy, that has to be Sudan. Back to you.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, we followed lots of what happened in Sudan with the protests and the push to get rid of Omar Bashir and stuff. I mean, do you think that has been replaced by a more responsive government? It looks very much like a military style dictatorship that looks like what we have in Egypt.
I think the transition is definitely shaky. It is in you know, in problems. Also, the economic situation hasn't helped. Remember, the transitional government actually inherited a bankrupt state, and the economy hasn't improved. Sudan has done you know, everything that they were asked to do by the international community. The US also lifted it from the you know, the designation of supporter of terrorism. But I think the economic dividends are only beginning to trickle in. And so it will take time for actually the country's economy to begin to grow. I think the economy is fundamental to Sudan, because if people don't see the economic benefits of actually democratization, then that creates disillusion. And this is why I think the international community has a vested interest in helping at least Sudan steer a democratic course, because we saw a threat actually last month when there was a coup attempt, and that coup was capitalized on massive popular discontent, especially in Eastern Sudan, about the prices of bread, the cost of living. And this, I think, is the dilemma, where you have a very good government, but also very fragile economic systems. And that, I think, disparity creates a big tension, which is exploited by, I think, forces that want to return Sudan back to the dark days. Back to you.
Okay, so we're coming towards the end of this. So I think we'll do a final round of just comments. I'd want to hear what you think is coming, what your predictions are for the future of liberal democracy, of the ideas that we have of one man, one vote, and what it represents, and whether you think Kenya will, or the region actually, will ever be a European style or American style a democracy, or might become like a Chinese sort of a dictatorship. Justin, do you want to go first?
Well, remember, there is no single European style.
All right.
It certainly wouldn't be the same as the United States style. I don't think that we should ever view the history of the region in terms of a trajectory towards being something like what Europe or the US is now. I don't think that's kind of a very useful way of thinking about it. I do think that elections almost certainly have a considerable future in terms of the ways that people argue over what democracy is and how they should be governed. They will continue to play a part in those arguments, but those are not arguments that ever have a final point in any society. There's not a point where politics stops anywhere in the world. That doesn't happen. Even places that like to call themselves liberal democracies, actually they're changing all the time. They've changed, they will keep changing. So too in this region. But I think elections will continue to play a significant part in the way that people argue about who should govern them and how they should be governed.
Right, thank you. And actually, that's a very good point about reminding me that these are not uniform places. It's all different wherever it happens. And I think the same can be said about the Horn. So maybe actually for Samira, do you think elections have a future in Somalia, have what do I put it, a rosy future, or will they continue to be as divisive and as problematic as they are now?
I believe I think we just have this hurdle to go through the current electoral process. But as all the political elite have learned, there is value in strengthening the federal system and this electoral process. So I have a feeling that it will be positive going forward, depending on my rosy view that there will be a change of leadership in the next year. So I think it's going to be positive from my point of view.
Actually, Samira, before I think I can't let you go without actually asking about the Somali experience with regard to changes of power. I think it's the one Somaliland has been kind of the one place I would say where the regulars change, the changing of the guard, if you will, through an election has become almost institutionalized. There's a vote, people leave. In Kenya, there's a vote, somebody's supposed to leave, and becomes violence. So my question is, do you think that there is lessons that the rest of the region can learn by looking at Somaliland, by looking at Somalia itself, with regard to peaceful handovers of power after an election?
I don't know if there's a lesson really for the rest of the region, just because this is an intrinsically Somali culture and a Somali thing. So I don't know if it's something that can be replicated elsewhere. But this is the one time, just to be devil's advocate, that if change of guard has gone so well, but a return of the same administration, we might not have the stability and security that we have seen in previous electoral cycles. So this might be one that determines whether we stick to that principle if the current administration returns. But this mentality, this is a Somali mentality. Accept, they agree when they agree on a process that they feel they each had a balanced go at. They will let it go.
Mm-hmm. All right, Rashid, what do you think about the future of elections in Ethiopia and in the region?
I think I see three distinct trends. One, of course, is what I call elite compact democracy, and democracy with quotes. This is Kenya and Somalia, where we have seen actually institutions that are supposed to manage and run elections become dysfunctional, largely because you have a very efficient system of elite compacting. So elections are either not run credibly or they fall apart, but that is okay, because when it is crunch time and there is a crisis, the elites from the different political parties will come together and agree a compact, and then the country will return to some semblance of normality. So elite compact democracy is actually something which will be with Kenya for a long time. I don't think the elite in Kenya are heavily invested in credible elections, largely because they have a very competent and efficient system of elite compacting.
Does that mean also that Kenyan elections will always be violent?
But violence can be managed by elite compacts. You know, when Raila Odinga just came out and said, turned his forces back to Kibera, then everything stopped. No more riots, and you know. So even the violence is managed by.
Yeah, but violence is part of this negotiation that elites have when it comes to.
And the same similar pattern also is discernible in Somalia, where the electoral machinery and the electoral agency has completely broken down, and the electoral process is managed by 5 regional leaders and the prime minister. So that is an elite compact. Now in Ethiopia, you have actually the structures and the rudiments of an institutional democracy, where you have a very competent and credible institution, agency, but then you are also beginning to see a more pluralistic system of actually politicking and campaigning, especially in rural Ethiopia. Now, the country that interests me most, and I think the country to watch, is Sudan. If Sudan succeeds, then I think we have probably the strongest candidate for a liberal democratic path in the coming years, largely because, as I said, you have a very strong iron will. You have the structures of organization, you have the culture of protest, the culture of not submitting to totalitarian governments, of rising up. All these I think put together makes Sudan a very interesting case. So you have these 3 paths to democracy. I don't know which one will eventually triumph.
Okay, all right, thanks a lot for that. I'm afraid we've come to the end of our webinar. That time has just flown. Just one quick note, all the previous webinars, you can find them on the Elephant. Just go to our editions tab and you'll see on the Horn of Africa elections. And you can watch and listen to all the previous webinars that we've had. And also there's quite a lot of material in terms of articles and interviews that we have done that are all nestled there. So feel free to go down and take a look. So over to you, Pauline.
Thank you so much, Garth. Thank you to the panelists, to Samira, to Justin, and to Rashid. Quite an interesting discussion. And yes, Rashid, I mean, didn't think of Sudan as a liberal democracy or a would-be example. So definitely we'll be looking out for that. And actually, just to flag up that we actually have a report done by RVI on Sudan and elections. Actually, Justin, thank you. So you can find that on our website. And as Patrick has said, you can find the previous webinars on their website, on the Elephant, on HBF site and our site as well. I still don't know if this webinar actually answered the question on whether elections in East Africa are a democratizing force or a violent flashpoint, but I think a lot of food for thought, and I think the key takeaway here is that I guess we cannot do without elections, that they'll still play a significant part on how people debate on how they're governed. So that is a good takeaway. And I mean, the question that Rashid also posed is about is there a global retreat from liberal democracy? So I think it's food for thought that as we go on, as Justin says, politics never actually ends. So it's an evolving space. So Asante Sana, thank you for joining us today. I would like to say thank you very, very much to our partners, to Henrik Ball Foundation, who funded this series, I know this is the last one for this series, and I do hope we can pick up for the Kenya election that is coming up. I know that will be filled with hot debates, and so we're looking forward to that. To Patrick at the Elephant, thank you. This was a wonderful partnership, how you curated the series on your site, and expanded our audience base and enriched the partnership so much. Asanteni sana. To my team at RVI, to Fatma, who is behind the scenes, to Liz, to our communications team in London. Thank you very much. I think I'll miss the elections forum every month. It's been going on for almost a year now. But yes, it was good while it lasted, and I do hope that we'll have another.
Well, hopefully, we'll pick it up and go on.
I'm sure we will. This is politics will never end. Thank you, Justin. So I think we'll scream that from the rooftops to all donors. So thank you very much. I hope you have a good afternoon, a good evening, a good morning if you're in that part of the world. And till next time, asanteni sana. This should be up on our sites, on our respective sites within a week or so. So kindly, keep an eye out for it. Thank you very much.